Okay, let's kick off the webinar then. First of all, welcome. This is our data and digitalization strategy webinar. There's a picture of myself. I must admit, a slightly younger version, and I'm Pete Davis, Director of Data Technology and Transformation at Reco. I'm also joined by my colleagues Nathan Gould and Neil Lockhart, who will introduce themselves later during their section of the presentation. In terms of some housekeeping, usual basics, which I'm sure many of you are used to, so please camera off and microphone unless you're presenting. Any questions you've got, raise them in Teams or on Slido, of which the link and the QR code is kind of left middle. Also, this presentation will be recorded, will be made available on our website afterwards. So should you or your colleagues want to revisit sections, you're able to do so. So let's then jump into some of the content. This here today is around our data and digitalization strategy, and really that strategy is focused around supporting the energy transition for society's benefit. So the way we went about building that strategy, and it's important to recognise this is a strategy, it's not an operational plan. We took our forward work plan. So those of you who are not familiar with the forward work plan, it's a yearly strategic document that sets out our plans for the next year and following years. And those are built around effectively the 5 C's of consumer, climate, competition, cost, and catalysing improvement. We took that forward work plan, those 5 C's, and then we worked on a set of design principles. And those design principles are there for effectively a set of guide rails around delivery. And they're focused on, as you would expect, the consumer, aiding competition, importantly, increasing our security, and also an aspect of interoperability to ultimately save costs. Some kind of ambitious, provocative things in showing some leadership around aspects, particularly on data, opening that up securely, managing it. And we also recognise the need to simplify our user experience. Where applicable, we're also moving towards more agile delivery, and I'm very deliberate in saying where applicable. And as the energy world moves to a more kind of flexible or more micro basis in terms of generation, consumption, etc., then we believe a need to move to more event-based handling is required. Ultimately, again, we'll procure our services ethically. Those design principles we've taken and we've delivered those and made those into effectively a vision. I think it's important that we set out a vision, and that vision is kind of a 10-year thing. Keep in mind, it is illustrative, it is designed to be strategic, and it gives us that kind of directionality for the future. And that's focused around being an internet and interconnected set of services, and a move to a microservice architecture with API gateway, which aims to reduce data duplication, increase our security, and give industry parties a reduced cost of change, which ultimately then is a benefit to yourselves. So that's a summary. Now it's time to kind of enter a bit more of the detail around that. So I've taken you through an overall summary. We first of all looked at the strategic needs based on the forward work plan. That one is some design principles that I've quickly skimmed through, an idea of a vision, and then ultimately the enablers that allow us to deliver that. But before I get into those strategic needs, I think it's important to recognise what this is and what this isn't in terms of a data and digitalisation strategy. So this strategic data and digitalisation document, or data and digitalisation strategy, sets out how we, Reco, will be working towards changing and evolving the energy industry. It does set out a vision. It does set out some capabilities that we believe are required for that strategy. And it's there to really provide a direction of travel towards other activities. What it isn't is a detailed list of software technology products that will be used, because we also recognise that software and technology evolves. And when we looked at a strategic direction, we considered more of a 10-year time horizon. And as we know, Good old Moore's law, 18 months, 2 years, depending on what view you use, computing power doubles or improves significantly in that time period. So specifying exact technology and software is not really a sensible thing to do around strategy, and it should be done on a project and use case by use case basis. Also, it won't include a detailed granular account of data items. Just as a side note, we are working on that, and I'll reference some running projects to give you an idea of actually how we're taking some of these strategic items forwards. Then it's not a granular breakdown of work and the associated timelines. They are tactical and operational matters. It is ultimately around providing yourselves and Reco with some clarity around where we believe things should go. It will hopefully inform conversations, and as we go through this, I've already hinted to you that there's a Slido involved, so there will be an opportunity for you to engage in some of those aspects and provide us feedback on where we think we should be taking things. So that's really a kind of some of what it is and what it isn't. I've hinted at the 5 C's at the start. So the Reco's forward work plan strategy is built around these 5 C's of consumers. So ultimately delivering consumer benefit. Climate, I think we all recognise that this is becoming once again an increasing piece on the agenda. The last maybe year, 2 years, cost of living has dominated. Cost of living will continue to be a strong aspect, as in the bottom left-hand corner, but climate aspects, I think, start to come to the fore. Appreciate that our current Prime Minister has maybe renegated or moved back on some of those aspects, but I think it would be remiss of us to ignore the climate aspects. Competition, a major part of the REC and regulation is to aid and support competition, because ultimately that should bring benefit to consumers. And then the 5th one is around improvement and really catalyzing improvement. You could say maybe we've shoehorned some words in here to make it 5 C's and ring through, but we also didn't want to just write change, because change would be almost for the sake of it. This is about positive change and actually driving that improvement across industry. So our strategic needs, we've taken a view with regards to this strategy as a combined data and digitalization strategy. Some organizations might say they have a data strategy and digital strategy, whereas for me, you can't really do one without the other. So data, in a nutshell, really is about making that data securely open, and Neil will take some time to explain what we really mean by that. It's also about making that data reusable and, importantly, machine readable. A lot of things that happen within industry are going to happen faster, and they're often repeatable things and similar or the same outcomes, and therefore machine readability is critical to that. Digitalization, as kind of illustrated by the Venn diagram in the background, does have some overlaps with data, but it isn't all consuming of that. And for us, digitalization really is a focus on providing a clear and simple user experience. I do recognise that some of the services and products that are currently provisioned under the REC are not at the standard that I would expect and many of you would expect, and we are taking steps to improve that. And if I kind of boil that down into a simple approach, is that actually the longer that industry yourselves are spending time with REC data, with REC systems, you're arguably not spending it on your business. So we are looking towards kind of really slimming down and reducing the amount of time, very much like some of the government services. Those you do, recently I did my tax for my car, and I found that process incredibly fast and easy to do, and that's the kind of direction we want to head towards. The second part is around architecture, and Nathan Gould will take you through what we mean by our microservice architecture, and that really driven by flexibility and security. So I covered off what the 5 C's were. In terms of data and digitalization, from a consumer angle, really that's around providing services in a user-friendly, easy manner. And I highlighted around kind of reducing the friction so that then industry and market can interact more with consumers. Just to highlight the second one down, we have done some work around consumer consent, and we think this is a thing that's important for industry, whether RECO executes this or another organisation or government body executes it. It's kind of irrelevant. The point is we do need to bottom this out for the consumer. Then we come to climate. Here, data, I believe, is a major part to play. And not only is it allowing access to organisations that maybe currently haven't got access to that, and I do know a number of you on this call are, I would say, a new audience for us, which is wonderful because it shows a level of interest in the data we have. We are making changes to how you do and have access to the data that is there. Ultimately, we hope that would help reduce energy consumption by consumers, and also give you access to those new sources and ultimately improve or reduce the carbon impact. Competition. Now, I think we can kind of get caught up quite a bit in competition, particularly as from the regulator, we've had a history of forcing switching to drive competition, etc. Well, competition we kind of view broadly in that sense that actually there are new entrants that are now looking to come into the market as prices come down, and there are innovators. And by innovators, I don't mean startups necessarily. I also include major large conglomerates in that because they can innovate and do innovate. And I used to be part of one of those, and we did innovate back then and challenge. So by innovators, we don't mean startups. We mean the whole range of organizations that can make an improvement in the market. Costs. Now, here, of course, we're looking to reduce costs, particularly the overall cost to serve. We believe we'll do that through improving the user experience that I highlighted previously, but actually it's around effective data management, reusing that data. And when Nathan talks through the enterprise architecture direction, you should see some kind of insights of what we're moving towards. And the final one, catalyzing improvement. Actually, a major part of data and digitalization is all around driving catalyzing improvement. And when you see a mapping later on that I talk through, you'll see it effectively appears in every column. And if we look back to the beginning of typewriters to emails, all of those general steps in and around computing have been around continuous improvement in processes and delivery of services. So those were how we took the need. Moving into the design principles, we broke this down into two parts, a what section and a how section. So the what, first one is around consumer, and ultimately this is around delivering the trilemma, as I call it. So the carbon side, the cost side, and the consequence of supply. Now, we're taking a consumer-led view on that, as opposed to a kind of maybe industry-wide view, as the REC is around delivering positive outcomes to consumers. We also believe that facilitating competition is important, and we'll do that by securely opening up the data and providing optionality in services. To give you an example of securely opening up data, there is currently a REC change going through for the inquiry services where we recognise the current listing of users and purposes under the REC is very limited. So we're looking to change the governance to enable new users and purposes to be added. It's very clear this is not a free-for-all. It's actually, there's many organisations that have a legitimate purpose for accessing that data, and we need to alter the governance means to enable that to happen in a fair and reasonable manner. In terms of optionality, Nathan will talk a bit through around how microservices can potentially enable that, and in the architecture bit I'll also talk a bit about alpha and beta type products. The third one, importantly, is on increasing security and competence. Speaking very openly, we have seen an increase in security events, both in terms of frequency and severity. So I think we all recognise that globally this is an increasing problem, but actually within industry we're seeing specifics in and around the services and organizations we interact with. So we will continue to improve our competence here, and we think that disaggregation of services will actually help with that, both in terms of control but also logging of what's happening. The fourth point is around interoperability. I think it's fair to say that when the REC came into being, I think, was it September 21, so it's come up to its second birthday. I don't know whether it's first or 30th, but in and around second birthday today. So a number of those systems were effectively inherited from historic arrangements, and we recognise that there is effectively an amount of duplication and maybe segregation that's not ideal. So over the next number of years, we'll move towards disaggregating that, breaking that down so that actually interoperability can take place, and addressing is a great example of that. The fifth one is maybe somewhat provocative, I mentioned, and did create some kind of debate internally around whether we should use the word leadership. What we're trying to do here and trying to emphasize is, instead of kind of waiting for a need to come along, when the initial ideas of a need start to happen, we start working on prototypes, testing technology, working with industry to actually see if that's a reasonable way of solving things. What I've become kind of quite akin to over the last year, and I joined Reco, it was more than a year, so June the 4th in 2022, been quite notable that a lot of projects end up taking to kind of large implementations which carry an inherent risk with them, and often we're not getting to that technology and interaction risk that can come further down the line. So believe that by testing some technology, working with organizations, that will help de-risk there. The other point here is it's really important to recognize that Reco is a small organization, around 30 people, and we intend to remain a small organization of more procure and manage, but also that doesn't mean that we should be held to kind of any sort of ransom around IPR. That goes both with the services that we provide, but also then for wider industry reuse. So a good example of that is recent papers and work we've done around open data and consumer consent. All of that is reusable for other organizations to quote, reference, etc. There's no kind of lockdown on what we say and do. So hopefully you'll see that as not only as requesting it, but walking the talk. Moving on to the how, off the back of what. The first how is utilising GDPR and other contractual licensing aspects to open up the REC control data. And I think actually GDPR is a great piece of legislation. Some people might find that controversial, but if we think about its origins, it's there to protect individuals, and if you understand with it and work with it, significant and useful things are possible. And some of the work we've done around theft is a great example of that. Last year we did the theft estimation methodology, which identified the cost of energy to consumer between 800 million and 1.4 billion, depending on where you sit on that scale. So that required us to really understand the data that we had, work with it, put controls in place to do those estimates, and work with organizations to achieve that. So it shows that these things are possible if you understand how to work with it. The second one, we see agile delivery playing a role in how we develop our services. Agile cannot be applied to everything. If I take, for example, the market half-hourly settlement program, that is a running large project where our ability to influence the methodology there is fairly minimal, and actually tying into hard, clear milestones provides better clarity to industry. So that approach there is potentially the waterfall is potentially more ideal for market half-hourly settlement. Agile delivery we've used when we've worked through some of our open data work, which I highlighted a change proposal at the start of the presentation. there will be a subsequent change proposal, but a large volume of that work around open data, we knew what direction we were heading in and where we want to be, but we didn't know how we would get there. So agile delivery helps with that. The third one is around improving our user experience. So I recognise that the current set of services, particularly around the rec portal, EMAR, Digital Navigator, is a point of frustration for industry. The work that was done on Digital Navigator is because of the frustration around EMAR. So improvements have been made, but we also recognise it's not enough. So we're continuing to invest in that to drive that experience and really reduce, as I said, the amount of time you're having to interact with some of these services, so you can therefore focus on interacting with the consumer. The fourth one is kind of almost an obvious one in the sense of data management. But what we mean by this is the metadata management. So some of you are familiar with the electronic markets data specification, sometimes gets also called EMAR, but that catalogue of data describing what it is, what its purpose is, where it's from, etc. We've done some work in the last 12 months to review all those items, also adding classifications around should the data be always open, should it be conditionally open, should it be personal, or should it be closed. We'll bring that analysis through in change proposals to come over the next 12 months, and we believe that will improve the data quality as a result. I highlighted at the start around where we think things are going. Well, solutions will be looking to design our event-based handling, and I think we can see that with the move towards market half-hourly settlement being event handling. Equally, we know that event handling only is not the answer, so batch will continue to be provided, because there's a large part of industry that still utilises this, and this is how things operate, and we cannot switch overnight, which also gives you kind of an insight into the longer time frame we're running, in the sense of a strategy looking over 10 years rather than maybe a 3-year period, which sounds a long time. And if I think about it personally, I think, well, that is a real long time and somewhat frustrating. But also we realise we're interacting with 150 plus organisations. All of you have different capabilities, different timescales, different plans, and we have to therefore take a more considered approach. And the final one is around ethical procurement. So, as I said, Recco is a small organisation. We procure and manage pretty much all the services we provide. We will continue to do that ethically and continue to stay within what is considered reasonable and legal aspects, and therefore be cognizant of the carbon impact that those services provide. So, how does that then map to the 5 Cs? I'll go quickly through, and then we'll come on to the kind of first aspect of Slido. So the consumer, we see that, of course, hitting the consumer, but theirs is around the climate aspect, cost aspect, catalysing improvement. You could say maybe competition, but actually what consumers want is either a reduced bill, easier access to service, or perhaps a positive impact on the environment, and not necessarily competition. Competition obviously ticks the middle box in terms of competition. Security, we also recognise this is a primary link to general improvement around catalyzed improvement, but the consumer themselves, they care about how their data is handled. Interoperability, again, has some benefit towards the consumer, especially considering that they'll be interacting through different organisations. So actually, if our data and services are interoperable, it helps, and that too should have a reduction in cost. Leadership, we classify more as a competition thing to aid and support yourselves in how you go about innovating and coming up with new products, ideas, etc. Open data, again, a link to the consumer and competition. On some of the how ones, so user experience, of course, the consumer, and improving catalyze, improving or making improvements. Agile, where it's applicable, it can deliver a cost reduction. That the key thing is where it's applicable. If you have a very clearly known outcome, etc., and you know how to get there, then that's probably not necessary. But where you're unsure and there's fairly spiky technology risk or maybe policy risk, you might want to go for an agile delivery. Data management, in terms of a link to consumer, this is more about, if we get the data right, then ultimately it helps with your interactions with consumers. And then event-based handling, that we do think will bring some cost benefit. Appreciate that maybe running batch and parallel has less cost benefit, but ultimately when we enter a more flexible driven system or energy as a service, a batch type approach is probably more expensive. And then the ethical side was more around climate aspects. You could actually go through each of these and kind of critique them and apply individual ones, but what we decided to do was focus on the primary drivers for that. Which leads us on to the first Slido. So here we're looking for your top 3 effectively. So of the 11 that I went through, and 11 was deliberate. We of course did have 10 at one point, but through discussion we came up with 11. So I like to kind of say we've taken a spinal tap approach in turning it up to 11. Yeah, now's your opportunity to really say, out of those 11, which do you believe is the most important? And I will flip back to this slide just so those of you can see it. See a few votes coming in. User experience leading, consumers battling out for second. This is, yeah, really helpful. Oh, security was high and it's fallen off the list. Feels like I'm maybe watching a Kentucky Derby on my other screen, and hopefully somebody will be able to see that. Otherwise, it'd be quite a strange commentary going on here. Yeah, we've got 20 odd votes, so I'll give it another 30 seconds. Wonderful. That has been really helpful. That gives us a really good guide. So for those of you who can't see it on your voting screen, consumers has been the outright winner at 70%, and user experience at 55%, open data at 38%, data management at 38%, and security then at number 5 at 33%. So I think the vote will remain open for a little bit longer. But that really helps us understand where you as industry think we should focus. So moving on to our vision. Now, I've been speaking for quite a while, so some of you might be glad that there'll be a couple more speakers in Nathan and Neil coming into this section. So our vision really is based around 3 component parts. So one is the centre, which we would call the architectural sphere. Then there is the connection to that, and the connection to organisations like yourselves. And then there is an element of kind of interconnectedness and shared needs between those organisations. But first, we're going to start with the architectural sphere, and in particular, the data principles at the heart of that. And I'd like to introduce Neil Lockhart, who will take you through those.
Thanks, Pete. And good morning, everyone. So just to introduce myself, I'm Neil Lockhart. I'm the Information Security and Data Protection Officer for RECO. I've been here at RECO for almost a year now. And prior to this, I've been working in information security within the financial services for about 12 years now. And as Pete said, I'll be speaking about the data principles. So on screen now are the data principles at the center of our universe. You may recognize these as being the very same as those data principles set out by the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, a deliberate decision on our part. In the case of the strategy, we are extending the use of these data principles from being limited to personal data, as per UK GDPR, to all data with the aim of creating secure openness. These data principles are examples of good practice and enable us to operate with a cautious approach to risk. This also enables us to deliver open data in the most appropriate and secure manner. I'll now speak through the principles and how we'll aim to work to them. Looking at lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, well, openness goes beyond just opening data up for use. It's also about being open about how data is used and demonstrating that lawful and fair use. Purpose limitation. Well, with this, data will be accessed and utilized only for the purpose it was provided for. So data minimization, only the adequate and relevant data should be provided to meet a task's requirements. Moving on to accuracy. As you'd expect, all data is required to be kept accurate and up to date. In doing this, we hope to build user confidence and trust in the data being used. Now, to support this, you then have storage limitation. We only ever want to store data for as long as required to carry out a task. Working with accuracy, this also helps to ensure redundant data is not kept within a data set. Now, security or integrity and confidentiality. As you'd expect for secure openness, integrity and confidentiality is critical to that success. We only want the data to be accessed by users allowed to do so. They would need to be protected from unauthorized users, but also protected from destruction or corruption or other unauthorized changes. Accountability. Finally, with accountability, in terms of UK GDPR, it makes sense that this focus falls to the data controller to be held accountable for any actions. Well, with the strategy, we believe this should be extended to data custodians and reg parties. The aim is to include accountability within contracts and licenses. In doing this, we hope that this will allow us to demonstrate compliance with the other principles, so the accountability will support the others. That's a quick covering of all the principles that we're aiming to use. And I'll now hand over to Nathan to walk you through the architecture.
I'm Nathan Gould. I recently joined Greco as the enterprise architect. I've worked in the energy industry for probably more years than I'd care to admit to, and across multiple IT disciplines. Okay, so as outlined, our strategy is to move towards microservices architecture. Broadly speaking, this is where applications are structured as a collection of services that are loosely coupled, independently deployable, and organized around business capabilities. Essentially, each microservice is designed to do one thing and to do it well. Based on feedback, many of you have already embraced microservices and are in the process of transitioning. So why are we doing this? Well, consistency. For example, we have multiple address resolution approaches. Each gives slightly different results. To maximize reuse, as well as improving consistency, reuse of existing microservices means less for each individual project to implement. For example, re-implementation of code, testing. Segregation of data. Freedom to evolve the way the data is managed without impacting other services. And in the event of a compromise, only that data is at risk. Efficiency and scalability. We can scale resources where they're needed, rather than making much more use of scarce compute resources than necessary. It also means a lack of duplication, fault isolation, and resilience. When one service fails, less is likely to affect everything else. Services should be designed to fail gracefully, and there are many patterns to help with that. The use of circuit breakers, for example, something which we could support with an API gateway. Since each service is responsible for a specific task, it's easier to implement security measures at the service level. And as Pete mentioned, regulations such as GDPR place strict regulations on how businesses must handle personal data, and microservices make it easy to audit data processing activities. Ultimately, it means faster time to market by combining maximal reuse of components with independent deployment. This leads to being faster to market as well as raising the overall quality of the ecosystem. So, as previously mentioned, one of the key enablers we see for that is an API gateway that provides a single entry point. This means if a service moves between providers, as long as the interface doesn't change, there's no need for any API consumers to make changes. That saves considerable effort across the industry. Offloading cross-cutting concerns, such as traffic management, which will not only save effort for the individual projects, but will also help service quality. So, for example, consumer cannot overwhelm a service such that a service degrades. Provides better visibility in terms of performance, service availability, and use. Improve security by leveling up security standards and that are in place. We intend to set a secure baseline. And that brings everyone up to the same level as an absolute minimum. It has the ability to provide denial of service protection. So there's lots of security layers that we can leverage by using an API gateway. And also, quite importantly, we intend it to improve the developer experience. So enhancing developer onboarding, for example, through the standard documentation portal that uses open standards. That will ease the adoption and reduce lead time for developers to become productive. All that combined with the new API management strategy will be able to support multiple versions of APIs to better manage releases. Changes should, where possible, be non-breaking. And that will mean that industry will be able to transition at their own pace rather than taking a big bang approach. And in turn, this de-risk rollout and eases resource planning. You can see from the sphere, there are a number of rooms that are illustrated. And to give you a flavour of the type of service, the rooms on the slide reflect potential microservices. So there's PSR, the Priority Service Register, to protect customers in need. PA, Performance Assurance, to aid improvement. TDS, the Theft Detection Service, utilising data to reliably detect energy theft. ABS, the address-based services, following on from the example I used earlier. One set of services rather than many that give different results. GS, Green Services, to provide a single version of truth for green incentives to customers. CC, Consumer Consent, the capture and sharing of consumer consent to services and data. CSS, Centralized Switching Services, enabling the switching of energy services easily by consumers. And ES, Inquiry Services, to understand important information about each energy meter point. These services are illustrative and in line with Agile principles will evolve over time. And we expect these could be delivered by partners much in the same way as now. At this point, I'd like to hand you back to Pete.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Nathan. Yeah, just to reiterate Nathan's point there around this is an illustrative vision, and many of those services are in existence today under the REC and many are not. But it's also important to recognise that in a component-orientated, microservice-orientated architecture, doesn't necessarily mean these services need to come directly from RECO. They can come from other organisations. We're here really to try drive a more interoperable environment, and this creates this vision is effectively an illustration of what that could be. So in terms of then looking at how we then interact with that, if I take four kind of core groups, We talk about on the right hand top right is wider industry. By wider industry, I mean fellow code bodies, government, i.e. Department of Energy and Net Zero, and then Ofgem, the regulator. And here we already see today an increase in interaction, particularly around some of the data that's there, and we've supported recent initiatives on certain payment approaches under the levelization activities, and we also anticipate supporting in and around prepayment levelization activities should that come. So that gives an idea of kind of the wider industry, and expect that to continue. And then in the bottom right hand corner we've got REC parties, and I actually would kind of broaden this to non-REC parties, particularly when I come to the top left as a comparator. Here today, this is the biggest area of traffic and interaction. A lot of that interaction is through the portal or different portals, be it electricity inquiry service, gas inquiry service. We see that still remaining the main interaction point and the highest traffic point in the future, and probably even in 10 years' time, it will still be the highest traffic point, because that's where, as I highlighted, 150 plus organisations that are signed up to the REC, or some of the services that are available under the REC. On the bottom left-hand side, then we've got consumers. Today, there's very minimal interaction with consumers. A few consumers know we do know look at the REC and how certain things are performing. However, that's fairly minimal, and in the future we anticipate that to remain minimal. But there is potential for increased interaction should activities happen around consumer consent or levels of automated switching. But a lot of that is to be bottomed out, with the primary route of interaction with consumers directly through the REC parties. And then the top corner, bracketed innovators. As I said previously, this is not a separate group of organisations. Actually, consumers can be innovators, wider industry can be innovators, existing REC and non-REC parties can be innovators. But wanted to pull them out because actually how things are done is maybe somewhat different. And if I then kind of move on to how we see those things looking different, well, actually those groups or categories have different needs. So hopefully you can see my pointer. In the top left corner, we've got the idea of alpha and beta versions. Now they're much more important to innovation rather than a production system. You want to interact with things, you want to test things. We want to get feedback from you to understand, is that what's required? That also then leads on to the more agile, iterative delivery and continuous improvement that we've referenced earlier. We also think that could help and improve things for the consumer. Then moving round this kind of ring towards other planets, then you've got the efficient and simple user experience that I've referenced, and that came out super high in terms of the voting. I always knew it was important, but to see it as number 2 in the list has really kind of given us, certainly given me further evidence that we need to keep improving here and putting more of a focus on it. Then for wider industry and REC parties, then the holistic view of systems and reuse of that, I think, is important. Ultimately, every time there's a change, we need to keep that level of change impact on organisations minimal, and that means system reuse and a holistic view needs to be taken. So that's our vision. I think Jenny's already opened up the which aspects of the vision should be completed most urgently. So I now draw you back to the Slido. Been very deliberate in having an open question here because it is an illustrative vision. It is not like the list of principles that are somewhat more precise. And we're interested in what you think should be completed, or what we've talked about you think should be completed most urgently. Not necessarily the most important, but urgent, i.e. things that need to be addressed within the next 1 to 3 years, because that will allow us when it comes to forward work planning, and that's due to be released in January, February next year, that will allow us to help better define those projects. So I can see we've had one response so far, which is around APIs. A transparent and logical process for accessing data. Yeah, I recognise that, and hopefully we'll see some changes in November. API gateway to create single location parties. I assume that was written also on the basis that there's a belief that would reduce costs to parties, because at the moment there is, in my view, too many access points, which potentially increases cost. We'll give it another 30 seconds, minute, as this maybe requires a bit more thought and time to type things rather than tick some vote buttons. Yeah, similar one then on streamline governance to process access data. Involved API gateway, user experience, making data available for local authorities. So, and there's a fairly clear theme coming through around access. And I'll just take a moment whilst others type some responses to that. So there is currently a rec change going through. I didn't intend to get so kind of nerdy, but it's change R118 for those of you who do want to look. And this change is currently, I think it's in consultation at this moment in time, which will shift how access to the inquiry services is done. And today, as I said, a list of users and a list of purposes, and if your name's not on the list, you're not getting in, which is incredibly infuriating, I can imagine. So we've raised the change which will say, if your name's not on the list and your purpose isn't defined, then please know as that type and that purpose you want it for. That will then be reviewed by the PAB, which is the Performance Assurance Board, for those of you who are not familiar, but effectively they look at overall industry performance against the REC. And if that group of people think that is a reasonable basis for accessing data, that user type and purpose will be added to the list, enabling you then to have access. So that's the first CP that's going through, and assuming all goes to plan, I think it will go in the November release. Forgive me, I can't remember exact release dates. The second CP that's happening is one around open data. So I said during past presentation, we've classified different data items. So of those data items in the inquiry service, we've gone through and classified those as always open, conditionally open, i.e. if you combine them, they'll either become personally identifiable or commercially sensitive, personal, and then closed, and closed is in line with Ofgem's definition under data best practices. So that classification has been done. It's been reviewed by all the relevant code managers who are owners of those data items, and there will be a rec change raised post the R118, which will look to bring in an attribute-based access to services. So instead of saying this is my user type, you say, well, I want these data items for this purpose, and if they fit the categorization that I've mentioned, then access should be granted. That will take a longer time to consult on because of the granularity, so I'd expect that to go all going well between April and July next year. The reason that we're doing the other one first is because actually we don't want to wait till April, July next year to improve access. Yeah, so had some similar responses come in, and hopefully those two example of change proposals will give some confidence. As I said, if you look at R118, that will give you an insight. Okay, moving on then. So we've talked through principles, a vision, then it's, well, how do we actually enable that to happen? And we see 5 enablers for that. 1 around data, then services, partnerships, technology, and analytics. So data, and it's great to see some of the comments around providing data. We are clearly not a leader in data today in how to open up the data in a secure, open manner. But that is what we are moving towards, and those two examples of change proposals, I hope, will give you an insight into what we're doing. Services, here, I think we've referenced it throughout, in that actually we should support the consumer competition and the energy transition. This is important because often a lot of system services are built for point purposes, and some of the issues we're now seeing with access around the inquiry services, for example, is because they were built for a certain purpose. They were built for considerations around what industry had at the time. That has now moved on, and we're seeing more and more people, local housing authorities is a good example, charging manufacturers, charging installation organisations who would value access to these. So in going into the future, we need to think more generally about the services we provide, so actually the additional use cases can be better catered for. Then analytics wise, recently we've been doing some work around the user experience, and we've identified areas of the platforms, and particularly around Portal, EMA, Digital Navigator, that are used more frequently than others. That's then allowing us to make data-informed decisions about what to improve. Historically, I think a lot of improvements were driven on who shouts the loudest, but actually we're getting more analytics, more information, more data rather, to then make informed decisions. And that plays through into the PAB, highlighting the Performance Assurance Board, and the PAF, the Performance Assurance Framework. Many of those aspects are data-driven. We also recognise that the PAB, the Performance Assurance, is somewhat young. It came into being under the REC. There was some performance regimes, I think, under SPA and MRA, but not at the scale of what happens under the REC. And further improvements need to be made there to ensure that delivers benefit. Partnering, as I said, RECO is a small organisation in the sense of around 30 people, and we spend around something close to 50 million on a total expenditure on the switching service, inquiry service, performance assurance, etc. But because we're a small organisation, we intend to remain a reasonably small organisation, and then we'll look to partner with that. And by partnerships, I mean working with both technology providers, professional service providers, who can give us some insight and intelligence into the work they're doing, not just on a transactional basis. That helps inform decisions, but also that partnership goes towards industry. So some of the recent work that we've done around the API gateway, engaging with a number of industry parties to understand, would that be a benefit? Not just assuming it's a benefit and then saying, well, to make it a benefit, what would you anticipate? And looking really to have a kind of collaborative understanding approach, not necessarily so transactional. Technology, really, it links to the kind of agile delivery and what Nathan spoke through with regards to the enterprise architecture. So we will keep up with technology, but it won't be bleeding edge. So don't worry, I don't intend to come around and implement a load of blockchain technology for moving of consumers around as to who owns what energy supply to what household. I think that is too bleeding edge for us, and therefore too risky. But really, we're talking about N-1, as it sometimes gets termed, to ensure that we do have that agility and don't get caught out in any sort of severe technical debt. So those are our 5 enablers, which we believe encapsulates the need for successful implementation. Some of you might be glad to know we're coming on to the last slide now. So here is a ranking exercise, and really we're looking for input from yourselves to say, of those 5 that I've talked through, please rank them from most to least important. And for those of you who can't remember them, here they are on the slide. So that's from most to least important. You can see things like data, top partnerships, So again, it's a bit like the Kentucky Derby, but there's a clear winner at this one so far. Data, yeah, things are not changing significantly. We'll give it another 30 seconds. So, yeah, see, there's one person doing the final ranking. A clear winner on data there, which I think backs up. Then I think open data was third or fourth in the other aspect, and then fairly equal running between service, partnership, technologies, and analytics being last, which is really helpful and insightful to us as to where we should provide and put our effort. So in summary, this is a strategy that I've talked you through, and a strategy is a long-term horizon over 10 years. When I first wrote this, and I come from working in a large corporate of E.ON into Uniper, so a long energy history, generally strategies had a kind of 3-year time horizon. So to do one for 10 years was somewhat daunting, but it also recognises that there's a good part of industry and organisation that we need to work through. And when I worked in a large corporate, it was very much about generating money, generating business, working and delivering things under the REC. It's around enabling others to achieve that, and therefore a more considered, longer view is required, as adverse impacts are just not acceptable. But equally, that doesn't mean we're just going to leave it alone and say, oh, 10 years done, do that. We will continue to review it annually, and we'll do that after the publication of our forward work plan. Our forward work plan consultation has started, and it will run through the next number of months, and then publication will be January, February. So once that's finished, we'll also take a review of this and say, is it fit for purpose? What have we learned from the forward work plan? Are there any adaptations that need to be made? As Nathan and Neil articulately put, our vision's around driving towards an interconnected set of services, and that move towards a microservice architecture and API gateway, for the benefit reasons that Nathan and Neil described previously. Our design principles are there to provide guide rails. So when it comes to starting projects and consideration of what goes in the forward work plan, those design principles are what we're utilising to select and engage on different topics. And those design principles and the vision is backed by those 5 key enablers, which you've clearly called out as data being the number one, and we take that feedback on and we'll continue to work around that. So that concludes the presentation. We'll now open up for some questions. Jenny, I don't know if we've had any questions.
Hi, yeah, we do have a few questions. Question first for you, Pete. How far do you see the digitalization of the code going? Could you see a time in the future where, for example, you may have a mobile app for use by remote workers, MEM/SIP engineers, for example, that could need to send comms flows, seek guidance on site?
So I'll answer it in reverse order. So today there's already tools out there that can provide flow guidance and guidance to engineers, technicians on site. So I'm not going to list who those companies are because I might list a few and I don't want to show any bias towards organisations. So that sort of thing does exist, provided by others. But going to the primary question of how far can it go, I hope you can see from our thinking there is a dominant focus around data, and ultimately then enabling people to have access to that data. So whether we go all the way into ultimately providing kind of flow guidance type things that technicians and engineers go, I don't think I can see that in the next 10 years. But that doesn't mean to say that could change through industry engagement and consultation, because new needs might come up, but it's not something that has come up so far in conversations and engagement with industry. So that kind of leaves a middle ground in light of how far do I think it could go. Well, of that sphere that Nathan talked us through and the potential services, that's where we would focus, and we would need to ensure that actually the user experience to access those was quick and easy to achieve. So that's ultimately for me where we would focus around digitalization, and not really take the space that others that are already potentially performing. So hopefully that answered the colleague's question.
Okay, and then we had another question. We previously had access to gas data from ExoServe/Ofgem. I'm currently not on the list of users. How do we get access?
Right, I assume and hope this is probably linked to some of the feedback that was just delivered in the open commentary section. So I said there's a change currently running through that hopefully will go live, whether it's the October or November release, I can't remember. So that change will allow a wider range of organisations to say, I want access to this and the purpose for that. And then that purpose would then be clearly defined. So hopefully that is a short answer to that question. But I recognise and hear the feedback that we're not good enough in this area and we are addressing it. I believe some of the organisations that have had these pains, I don't want to list them, but we have had some engagement with councils. We have had some engagement with charger manufacturers, charger installers around what do they need. So your input that you've already given for us, that has helped us shape that change proposal to make the changes.
And the final one for you is, what is RECO's involvement in energy data and digitalisation, and how will you ensure no overlap between the Energy Digitalisation Task Force work with Icebreaker 1?
So we have strong engagement with the Catapult team from that Energy Digitalisation Task Force, and a number of our ideas, initiatives have actually stemmed from that work. When we looked at it, there's things like asset registration, which we considered maybe something should be driven by REC, but actually then thought, well, no, there's probably better organisations to do that. Again, there was stuff around digital spy and digital fabric, which was like, are we really best placed to achieve that? Probably not, because we're kind of more towards the front end, towards the consumer. But then things like consumer consent being coded in and around the consumer, we felt we were well positioned to facilitate that to happen. So we've had engagement with them. Additionally, have close engagement with the Ofgem digital team run by Marzieh Zafar, and with the digital team in the department run by James Morgan. So the links are there and the engagement is had there. In terms of the specifics of Icebreaker 1, so when it comes to our open data, which will come live, hopefully all going well with the change between April and July next year, we are looking at not just how we provide access to our services, but should we be putting that data on a pre-existing open data, open energy type portal? There are other organisations out there beyond open energy. So we're doing our due diligence as to what the best ones are, and it might be we put it on multiple different sites so then the necessary licenses get used. So that's a long way of me saying we're engaged with the right organisations and we intend to reuse what's there out there. I don't feel there's a need for us to build our own open data portal, for example.
I said that was the last one, but that's not the last one. Who will pay for these new data services? If not REC parties, who fund REC, then how, and is that fair?
So let's break that down. Sorry, Jenny, could you give that a little bit slower? Because there's like 3 questions in there, I think.
Who will pay for these new data services? If not rec parties who fund rec, then how, and is that fair?
Yeah, so the way the rec is funded today is principally through two measures. One is on a per meter basis that the suppliers have. There's then I think some charges for distributors. Forgive me, it's not a level of expertise here, and we can provide a better written answer to this when speaking to the commercial director. And then the third bit is actually those that are what we call non-rec parties, i.e. that they don't necessarily have a license. They do things like third-party intermediaries, switching websites, etc. They pay for access to those services. And that's done on a kind of fair and equitable basis of cost recovery. So in the future, we expect that to maintain. And in a recent RECO board discussion, we did talk about what is the right way to do that. And the reality is that RECO is a monopoly of some of these data sets. And therefore, going out making serious commercial gains from that is not ethical or potentially not even legal. So we're currently reviewing what does it mean to be a monopoly and what is considered fair recovery, and that's very much focused around cost recovery for those services for organisations who are not rec parties. I think that ultimately will be how things are then dealt with fair, because that is a basis for law and seems reasonable. I think that answers the questions. Jenny, maybe just repeat them because there was 3 there.
Yep. It was, who will pay for these new data services? If not rec parties who fund rec, then how, and is that fair?
I think I answered the second 2. The first one, it would be achieved through those mechanisms, and whether a new service, etc., is added, it goes through the standard consultation process we have for budgeting and forward work plans. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, and I did notice there's thankfully a good number of new members in this call, our forward work plan effectively runs yearly. It's released in January, February. That includes what we're going to do and a budget to that, and industry then has a right to review that and ask questions, which we will then clarify, and ultimately if they're not happy they can appeal those budget lines. And that appeal, by the way, goes to Ofgem, for those who don't know. Jenny, it's probably worth us just sending out after this a link to the forward work plan process, because I think there's a few questions related to that, and maybe everyone's not in the know of that.
No problem. Thanks, Pete. Just one question for Neil. What advice do you have for end customers suffering from poor data integrity on Echoes/Exoserve? How can we help our suppliers/metering agents store our information better?
Okay, so I think what we might need to do is just determine what we mean by data integrity in this instance, because I've spoken around data integrity as being safe from corruption, deletion, unauthorized changes. However, I don't think that's what we might be talking about here. It's probably more about data quality and accuracy. We certainly want data to be accurate, up to date, and relevant. Otherwise, we just won't have confidence in it. So in the first instance, I'd always recommend raising issues with data quality at source. If you're receiving data from Echoes, then raise it there in the first instance. However, with the use of the word suffering there, I would be interested in see if there's anything we can do to support there, perhaps off the side here. So if the asker wouldn't mind sending us the details of the issue direct after the webinar, we can look into this and see if there's any additional support we can offer. Hopefully that answers the question.
Sounds good. Those are all the questions we've received.
Jenny, I've just looked in the Q&A in Teams. Did you pick that question up? Is that one you shaped up?
Yes, I think it fell under a previous one we'd received.
Okay, well, that's come from Brett, and Brett, if he hasn't answered your question, do just contact me directly. I can see from your commentary you're from Coventry City Council, and our operations director Mark has been speaking, I believe, that your colleague Lau about this. So it might be worth checking with him. But Brett, if you have any further questions, do contact me directly on pete.davies@retailenergycode.co.uk. Wonderful. Well, if that is all the questions, which I think it is, I think there's been a question in the chat as well. Yeah, absolutely. There'll be, the slides will be circulated, the recording will be circulated, and yeah, we welcome any further feedback. On that note, yeah, I think, Jenny, is there going to be a feedback thing after this event for people, or is that already in the chat?
So there's a link in the chat that you can click through, and yes, we'll be sending an email around to everyone that attended with a link to the slides and the chance to fill in that feedback form as well.
Cool, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining. I wish you all a wonderful day and rest of the week. Cheers all.